Ancient Egypt wasn't the silent world of stone and sand people imagine today. It was a place where lions prowled, giant wild cattle crashed through the reeds, and strange animals now lost to history still walk the edges of the Nile. So these are 10 extinct animals the ancient Egyptians once saw with their own eyes. Number 10. The ancient North African elephant. Elephants were once part of the ancient Egyptian world, and that fact is pretty surprising. Not just imported war animals, not only carved ivory, but living elephants in the broader Nile region. A detailed study of elephants in ancient Egypt and Nubia says the oldest petroglyphs in the region included elephant hunting scenes, and that ivory was being harvested in North Africa and the Nile Valley at least 6,000 years ago, and that rock drawings in Upper Egypt from the 4th or early 3rd millennium BCE show many pictures of elephants. That gives the animal a powerful place in Egyptian history. It begins as part of the actual landscape, and then it slips away so early that later Egypt remembers it more through ivory, prestige, and contact with the South. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from Hierakonpolis. In the elite HK6 cemetery, archaeologists uncovered the burial of an African elephant among a remarkable group of prestigious animals. The site report makes clear that this wasn't a random scatter of bones. The elephant had been buried whole, and elephants form part of a ceremonial animal complex tied to elite power. The elephant was large, it was difficult to control, expensive to move, and impossible to ignore, so its presence in that cemetery says a great deal about both the status of the animal and the reach of the people who acquired it. The elephant must have been overwhelming in an Egyptian setting. Most of the famous animals in Egyptian art are dramatic because of their speed, their horns, or their danger. The elephant works a bit differently. It's dramatic because of its size. A giraffe is tall, a lion is tense, a hippo is massive in the water, but an elephant brings bulk and deliberate force. In early rock art and later visual culture, that shape would have stood out instantly. The same long study notes that by the New Kingdom, the African elephant had died out in Egypt, but elephants continued to be sourced farther south for trade, display, and later warfare. The label North African elephant also needs some careful handling here. Ancient sources and later scholarship often refer to a now extinct North African population, sometimes treated as a forest elephant form. The study on elephants in ancient Egypt and Nubia says the North African elephant became regionally extinct by the 4th century CE under heavy pressure of warfare, spectacle, and ivory demand. That later extinction happened well outside Egypt, but it matters here because it shows that the elephants once known in the wider northern part of Africa didn't survive into the modern world. So people aren't looking at a living African population that merely moved away, it's looking at a vanished northern population that ancient Egyptians and their neighbors once knew directly. And that creates an unusually long historical arc. First, there's the early Nile world, where elephants appear in the rock art and lived close enough to be hunted. Then there is pre-dynastic elite Egypt, where whole elephants could have been buried ceremonially. Then there's the dynastic Egypt, where elephants are no longer native to the Nile Valley, but they still matter enormously through ivory and long-distance contact. Finally, there's the classical world, where North African elephants are driven towards extinction altogether. Few animals show the shrinking of Egypt's natural world so clearly. The elephant begins as a real part of the environment, and then it ends as an absence. That's why this animal belongs on the list. It's not there because elephants are famous, it's there because the ancient Egyptian evidence captures them at the moment when they were still close, still tangible, and still real enough to hunt, bury, and fear. The temples, tombs, rock drawings, and ivory objects are all traces of that older world, and behind them stands an elephant population that no longer exists in North Africa, and a version of Egypt that was far wilder than the one remembered today. Number 9. The Bubal hartebeest. Long before the Egyptian landscape narrowed into the river and desert world most people imagine, its margins held herds of a now lost antelope known as the Bubal hartebeest. In ancient Egyptian art, this animal shows up again and again. Egyptologists identify it as one of the most common species in desert hunt scenes, and one of its earliest clear appearances is on the Narmer macehead from Hierakonpolis, where the three animals in an enclosure can be identified by their horn shape and long, narrow muzzles. Now, what made the Bubal so visually distinctive was its shape. It was built unlike a gazelle, unlike an aurochs, and unlike cattle. Its shoulders sat high, its back sloped downward, and its face looked unusually long. Its horns rose in a broad U shape before curving outward. Egyptian artists were very good at reducing animals to their most recognizable silhouette, and the hartebeest gave them a strong one to work with. In hunting scenes, it looked like an animal made for speed over open ground, but not in the graceful, floating way of a gazelle. It looks tougher, heavier in the chest, and more angular, and that made it perfect for wall scenes and reliefs, because even a simplified outline was enough to identify it. The ancient Egyptians didn't only paint the animal. At Hierakonpolis, the elite cemetery known as HK6, archaeologists found a pregnant hartebeest buried among a whole remarkable group of high-status animals. That also included an elephant, an aurochs, a hippopotamus, crocodile, baboons, cattle, goats, and dogs. The site report says that the hartebeest showed signs consistent with captivity before burial, and that doesn't mean Egyptians domesticated them, and it would be wrong to claim that, but what it does show is direct, close contact. This was an animal people caught, controlled for a time, displayed, and then buried in a ceremonial context. It was part of the living world around the elite pre-dynastic Egyptians. A 2025 zoological study confirmed that the extinct Levantine hartebeest belonged to the North African Bubal lineage, and notes that the hartebeest was extirpated in North Africa in the early 20th century. Egyptian imagery has long been associated with the Bubal hartebeest, and the same broader North African lineage clearly existed close to Egypt, but scholars are still refining how the populations fit into the picture. So the safest way to say it is this: the ancient Egyptians definitely knew hartebeest, and the extinct North African Bubal lineage is the strongest match for the form most often associated with the Egyptian depictions. It's not just extinct, it belonged to a version of North Africa that no longer exists. The Nile world once opened into broader grasslands and savanna-like margins that could support large antelope like a hartebeest. Over time, hunting and growing human pressure pushed many of these animals out, and a modern study of Egyptian mammals does identify the hartebeest among the large-bodied herbivores that disappeared early from Egypt's long record. So every time one appears in Egyptian art, it's doing two jobs at once. It's showing a real animal, and it's preserving a real environment that later vanished. The Bubal hartebeest was not one of those creatures that vanished into deep prehistory. The North African form survived into modern times before finally disappearing. But that means when ancient Egyptian artists painted it, they were recording an animal with an incredibly long history, one that endured through pharaohs, empires, and centuries of change before finally being lost. In that sense, the Bubal hartebeest is more than just an extinct antelope. It's one of the clearest surviving images of a forgotten Egyptian wild world. Number 8. The aurochs. The aurochs wasn't just a wild cow, it was the original giant, the extinct wild bovine from which domestic cattle ultimately descended, and in ancient Egypt, it was one of the most formidable animals anyone could encounter. A major study devoted specifically to aurochs in Egyptian art identifies a remarkable relief at the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, dated to about 1175 BCE. In this scene, the pharaoh hunts 3 aurochs, and the author calls the relief stunningly realistic. The animals are shown with clear anatomical precision, and the adult bull is fleeing towards the reed belt of the Nile. Now, this isn't a fantasy beast or a generic herd animal, it is a specific extinct species shown with enough detail to tell it apart from domestic cattle. Now, that distinction would have mattered immediately to anyone seeing the real thing. The auroch was larger, more dangerous, and more imposing than ordinary cattle. Britannica describes it as an extinct wild ox that stood as much as 1.8 meters at the shoulder and survived in central Poland until 1627. It had long, forward-curving horns and the kind of size that turned a hunt into a prestige event. In the Egyptian context, though, the size mattered politically as much as visually. The Medinet Habu study suggests that by Ramses III's time, aurochs hunting may have been reserved for the pharaoh, and the scene may have represented one of the species' last appearances in Egypt. That gives this relief a strange double meaning. It's royal propaganda, but it's also one of the final visual records of a disappearing animal. Of course, Egypt had known the aurochs for a very long time before that. Egyptian art includes earlier depictions, and the broader iconographic record shows that artists consistently understood what separated the aurochs from domesticated cattle. The same Egyptian art studies does point out that hunting scenes often include aurochs alongside antelopes, gazelles, and wild donkeys. But the Medinet Habu scene is exceptional because it seems to place the animal in a real Nile edge habitat rather than in a more symbolic sequence of prey. The aurochs also shows how misleading the word cattle can be. Modern cattle feel familiar, manageable, and they're tied to agriculture. The aurochs was the untamed version behind them, larger and far less forgiving. That's why it worked so well in Egyptian royal hunting imagery. It represented more than just meat or hide. It represented dangerous strength brought under control by kingship. A pharaoh killing an aurochs was making a statement about dominion over nature, just as surely as a pharaoh confronting a lion or a foreign enemy. And because the animal was real, the symbolism had some weight to it. Everyone would have known how risky such a hunt was supposed to be. The species didn't vanish in pharaonic times everywhere. It held on in Europe for millennia after it disappeared from Egypt. Britannica does note that the last known aurochs survived in Poland until 1627, which means the animal did outlast the pyramids, classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the beginning of the modern era before finally dying out. So when ancient Egyptian artists carved one into temple walls, they were recording a creature that still had a very long future ahead of it, even though Egyptian chapter was already nearly over. It is fully extinct, it's visually unmistakable, and it's securely documented in ancient Egypt. It was large enough to dominate a hunt scene, dangerous enough to matter politically, and rare enough by the New Kingdom to feel like a royal quarry rather than just an ordinary animal. And now it's gone. What remains are horns and the massive shoulders and the rush into reeds and the image of species disappearing from one of the world's most famous civilizations long before the rest of the world lost it too. Number 7. The Syrian elephant. When Egyptian armies pushed deep into the Levant, they entered a world that still held one of the most surprising animals in the ancient Near East: elephants. Not the African elephants known from the Nile world farther south, but the extinct Western population often called the Syrian elephant. The clearest Egyptian link comes from the reign of Thutmose III. During his campaign in Syria, Egyptian records describe a royal elephant hunt near Nile, where the pharaoh reportedly encountered a herd of 120 animals. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Egyptian rulers directly saw and hunted living elephants in Bronze Age Syria. By the New Kingdom, Egypt was no longer limited to the Nile Valley. The armies, officials, and tribute networks extended into regions with completely different wildlife. The Syrian elephant lived in that zone. Later research on the species does describe it as the westernmost historic population of Asian elephants and notes that evidence for it disappears during the first millennium BC. In other words, this was a real elephant population living on the edge of the ancient Egyptian imperial horizon, and it was already heading towards extinction. The animal itself would have been astonishing to an Egyptian audience. Elephants were always rare enough to carry political weight, but the Syrian population seems to have been especially valuable because of ivory and prestige. Recent studies on the species argues that these elephants may not have been an old native relic population in the strictest sense. One 2016 study concluded that Asian elephants were probably introduced into the region by human agency during the Bronze Age, rather than representing a long, uninterrupted local lineage. The elephants Egyptian kings hunted in Syria may have been part of a population that existed there because human trade and movement had already reshaped the region centuries earlier. A lion hunt, it already looks dangerous. An elephant hunt looks like something from another scale entirely. The size alone would have changed the entire scene. Men, horses, chariots, spears, and bows suddenly measured against a wall of muscle, tusk, and trunk. The Egyptian state understood the value of that image, so royal hunts were never just about meat. They were performances of control over the most powerful animals a king could reach, and in Syria, that included elephants. The extinction of this elephant population, though, seems to have come quickly in historical terms. Scholarly work on the Syrian elephant says some pictorial, textual, and physical evidence fades out during the first millennium BC, and other research places the end of the population by roughly the 8th century BC, or later at the latest. Hunting pressure, ivory demand, and shrinking habitat all likely played a role, but whatever its exact taxonomic label, the result was clear. The elephants seen by the Egyptian kings in Syria are gone. It wasn't an everyday Egyptian animal, and it didn't live along the Nile beside temple towns and wheat fields, but ancient Egyptians absolutely saw it, hunted it, and recorded it. It belonged to the outer edge of Egypt's imperial reach, where conquest brought the pharaoh face to face with animals most people in Egypt would never encounter. And because that western elephant population later vanished completely, the Egyptian record now preserves one of the last human civilizations ever to know it firsthand. Number 6. The Balsam shrew. Not every extinct animal the ancient Egyptians saw was huge. One of the most unusual was tiny enough to fit in your hand. The balsam shrew is an extinct species known from ancient Egyptian embalmed and mummified specimens. Now that alone makes it extraordinary. Unlike the aurochs or Syrian elephant, this animal is not known from dramatic royal hunting scenes. It survives in the record because the Egyptians preserved it as part of a religious system that treated even very small animals as a sacred offering. Shrews were important in ancient Egypt far more than their size would suggest. They were linked to religious practice, and shrew mummies have been recovered from numerous cemeteries and tombs across Egypt. A modern survey of ancient Egyptian shrew materials does list several species identified from mummified remains. Another taxonomic review gives its known Egyptian material from Akhmim, and that means the extinct species is not a guess based on folklore or art, it's a real mammal identified from real Egyptian votive or funerary materials. What makes the balsam shrew really cool is that it changes the scale of this whole list. Ancient Egypt didn't only lose spectacular megafauna, it also preserved evidence of vanished small mammals that would otherwise become almost invisible to history. A Holocene extinction survey does note that this one was apparently endemic to swamps and gallery forest environments in the Nile Delta. This wasn't a desert-adapted miniature animal living on the bare edge of survival. It likely belonged to a denser, moister habitat that later contracted or disappeared. There's also something eerie about the way the species entered science. It wasn't discovered alive in the wild and later lost. It was described from ancient remains, and that means the Egyptians had seen it, caught it, mummified it, buried it, and then it vanished long before zoologists formally recognized the animal as a distinct species. In a sense, the Egyptians became its only direct witness, and the species moved from living creature to religious object to museum specimen without ever entering modern wildlife observation as a living animal. The balsam shrew, though, would have not impressed anyone with its size, but it had another kind of impact. It does reveal how obsessively attentive Egyptian religion could be to the animal world. Large animals projected power, small ones could carry symbolic force. A civilization willing to embalm shrews in large numbers was a civilization observing the natural world at every scale, from elephants to insectivores. It proves that extinction in the Egyptian record is not just a story of big game disappearing from the horizon, it's also a story of tiny, local species disappearing from ecosystems. And that may be the strangest bit of all. Most extinct animals are remembered through their bones in caves and fossils and sediments. The balsam shrew is remembered because ancient Egyptians preserved them. Without that religious practice, this species might have vanished without leaving a name behind. Number 5. The Nubian wild donkey. The Nubian wild donkey sits at a very uncomfortable edge between history and disappearance. Ancient Egyptians definitely knew wild donkeys. Egyptian art shows them in desert scenes, foaling scenes, and royal hunts. A major study of Egyptian animal imagery notes that the wild donkey does appear in desert hunt scenes, that it was already present in pre-dynastic rock drawings, and that royal hunts of wild donkeys appear on Tutankhamun's painted chest and Medinet Habu. This isn't an obscure creature, it was part of the visual vocabulary of Egypt from very early on. Ancient DNA research shows that the Nubian wild donkey was one of the maternal ancestors of domestic donkeys, and that means the line between wild and domestic in ancient Egypt wasn't theoretical. The animal moving through the desert hunt scenes and the animal later carrying goods, grains, and stone for the Egyptian state were closely connected. Its modern status is the part that has to be carefully stated. Some references treat the Nubian wild donkey as presumed extinct or extinct very recently, while genetic research has warned that maternal lineages may have survived in eastern Sudan until surprisingly late, perhaps even into the 1990s. So it's basically safer to describe the Nubian wild donkey as probably extinct rather than pretending that the case is completely closed. But even with a caution, the larger point is solid. The ancient wild donkey population directly tied to Egypt's earliest donkey history has effectively vanished from the world of normal observation. The wild donkey had none of the theatrical grandeur of the elephant or the massive horns of the aurochs. Its power came from its toughness. Artists recognized the long ears, the compact build, and the short dark mane, pale coat, and stubbornly alert posture that separated it from later domestic donkeys. In the desert, that shape would have meant endurance, speed, dryness, and distance. These animals were built for hard country, and that made them ideal prey in royal hunting scenes. There is also a deeper irony in its story. Many extinct animals on this list were lost because people hunted them, displaced them, or destroyed their habitat. The Nubian wild donkey is another kind of loss. Part of it survived by becoming something else. Its legacy didn't vanish completely, it was absorbed into domesticated life. The wild animal faded, while its domesticated descendants spread across the ancient world. Egypt didn't merely witness that transformation, Egypt helped drive it. So that makes the Nubian wild donkey one of the most important animals in the entire countdown. Even if its final extinction date remains uncertain, its world is gone. The free-ranging wild ancestor shown in Egyptian art is no longer part of the landscape that created Egyptian civilization. What remains are the painted hunts, the early rock drawings, the royal scenes, and the millions of donkeys that followed in its wake. In a list about extinct animals seen by ancient Egyptians, few say more about how Egypt changed the animal world around it. Number 4. The Barbary lion. The lion ancient Egypt knew was not just a symbol that was carved into stone. For thousands of years, lions were part of the real animal world around the Nile. A University of California Santa Cruz study on ancient Egyptian mammals notes that lions were among the species recorded in artwork from the late pre-dynastic period, but no longer found in Egypt, and the same research used those images to help reconstruct a much richer lost ecosystem. The Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at Memphis goes even further, stating that lions were abundant in prehistoric and historic Egypt, roaming the deserts on either side of the Nile Valley before disappearing during the New Kingdom and eventually becoming extinct in Egypt. That's why the later label Barbary lion matters here. In modern zoology, the term is used for the extinct North African lion population that once ranged from Morocco across the Maghreb into Egypt. A 2013 study on the extinction of the Barbary lion explains that its decline is unusually well documented in sources, and that the surviving remnant populations probably lasted later than many older books claimed. In other words, it wasn't a legendary lion, it was a real North African population that survived into modern history before vanishing. In Egypt, though, lions carried a double life. They were feared as actual predators, but they were also absorbed into royal power so completely that it can be hard to separate the living animal from the symbol. Memphis notes that depictions of pharaohs hunting lions are common, and that some pharaohs, including Ramses II, may have kept lions as pets. Britannica's entry on Thutmose IV adds another telling detail. Before becoming king, he spent his leisure time hunting near Memphis and the pyramids on the western desert. And that puts the lions directly in the landscape of elite Egyptian life, not in some distant wilderness, but in the desert margins around one of Egypt's greatest centers. Visually, the lion fit Egypt almost too well. It was the perfect royal animal, low, muscular, silent, and explosive when it moved. A bull could represent brute force, and a falcon could represent height and vision, but the lion represented concentrated dominance. That's why lion imagery is spread everywhere, from guardians and sphinxes to goddesses and royal hunts. The extraordinary thing is that behind all the symbolism was a real predator that once walked the same desert edge where the Egyptians farmed. The extinction story, though, makes the whole image of these lions darker. The study shows that North African lions were pushed back over time into remote refuges, surviving longest in the Maghreb before disappearing under heavy hunting. By then, Egypt had already lost its lions much earlier, so when an Egyptian artist carved a lion hunt, or when a sculptor shaped a crouching lion for a temple approach, the image was more than praising royal strength. It was preserving a predator that would one day vanish not only from Egypt, but from North Africa altogether as a living wild population. The Barbary lion was one of the most powerful animals ancient Egyptians could see with their own eyes. It shaped their art, their kingship, and their sacred imagination. And now the population that once ranged across their world is gone. The lion remained in stone long after it disappeared from the sand. Number 3. The Benu heron. The strangest bird on this list may also be the most uncertain. In ancient Egyptian religion, the Benu was a sacred bird linked with rebirth, creation, and the rising sun. The Oriental Institute's Between Heaven and Earth, Birds in Ancient Egypt describes the Benu bird in the form of a gray heron, which already tells you something important. The Benu was not imagined as a hawk, eagle, or vulture. It was tied to the shape of a long-legged marsh bird, something recognizably heron-like from the beginning. What pushes this story into extinction territory is a later paleontological twist. A Holocene extinction survey published by Oxford notes that the extinction of a wetland bird called the Benu heron, last recorded from the Arabian Peninsula around 4,500 years ago, archaeological fauna tables in Daniel Potts' Before the Emirates lists a giant heron. It's identified from al-Nar. That means the extinct giant heron was real enough to enter the scientific record, and it existed in the broader Eastern world connected to Egypt during the Bronze Age. This is where the evidence has to stay careful, though. The extinct bird is real, the Egyptian Benu is real, the exact bridge between them is the uncertain part. Some writers have suggested that the extinct giant heron may have been the animal model behind the Benu tradition, and that's why the species was given its name. But the hard evidence doesn't prove that the ancient Egyptians definitely saw this exact species in Egypt itself. The best cautious version is that the Benu heron is plausible natural models for part of the tradition, not a proven one. A giant heron would have looked uncanny in the Nile world. Ordinary herons already seem elegant and severe with their long necks, stabbing bills, and stillness in shallow water. Scale that up to a much larger bird, and it begins to feel exactly like the kind of animal that could slide into religion, almost unchanged. It wouldn't need much imagination. It would already look supernatural standing in the morning light above the marsh water. And that's pretty much what makes the Benu heron so compelling, even if it sits closer to the boundary between certainty and interpretation than the lion or the aurochs. Ancient Egypt definitely remembered a sacred heron. The Holocene record definitely includes an extinct giant heron from the broad region and era, and whether those two stories meet in a single real bird can't be proven cleanly, but the overlap is strong enough that the idea has never gone away. The Benu heron stands at the point where extinction, religion, and memory start to blur together. Somewhere behind the sacred bird of rebirth may have stood a real giant heron, alive in the Bronze Age world, then gone before history could describe it clearly. If that link is true, then one of Egypt's most famous sacred birds was based on an animal the world hasn't seen for thousands of years. Number 2. The Atlas bear. Towards the top of this list sits the Atlas bear, the extinct brown bear of North Africa. Ancient Egypt absolutely knew bears, but the bear most securely represented in Egyptian art is usually identified as the Syrian brown bear, not the Atlas bear. A study on the representation of brown bears in ancient Egypt says Syrian brown bears appeared in Egyptian art from about 3000 BCE to the Roman period, while also noting that there's no archaeological evidence confirming bears lived in Egypt itself. Meanwhile, the genetic work on North African brown bears shows the Atlas brown bears represented a highly divergent lineage. That pretty much makes the Atlas bear interesting, not because it can be placed neatly inside Egypt, but because it belonged to the wider North African world on Egypt's western side. It was Africa's only native brown bear to survive into historic times, and later accounts and genetics both point to a now lost lineage in Maghreb. In practical terms, though, that means the ancient Mediterranean world once included an African bear, and that world overlapped with Egypt's sphere of contact and trade. Even if Egyptian artists were usually looking at Syrian bears when they painted them, the existence of an extinct North African bear still expands the animal map around Egypt in a way most people never picture. Roman-era descriptions suggest that the Atlas bear may have been compact, dark-furred, and somewhat different in appearance from better-known Eurasian brown bears. A short historical review notes that clues to its appearance come partly from Roman mosaics, which show a small, short-faced, short-clawed animal with thick dark fur. It's not enough to reconstruct it perfectly, but it's enough to imagine the kind of predator North Africa once had and later lost. For ancient Egypt, though, the deeper point is this: bears were foreign enough to be rare, but not so foreign that Egyptians failed to notice them. The bear in Egyptian art symbolized danger from beyond the familiar Nile world, and that's why the Atlas bear works as a near-bottom entry in this countdown. It's not a clean Nile valley like the hippo, and it's not as securely Egyptian as the aurochs or the lion, but it belonged to the same larger, vanished North African animal group. It reminds us that Egypt's animal horizon was never limited to what lived right beside the river. There's also something unsettling about how complete the loss was. Once North Africa had its own brown bear lineage, now it does not. The genetic study on the Atlas brown bear makes that point especially sharp by showing that the lineage was highly divergent and is no longer represented among living bears. It wasn't just a local population fading away, it was a unique branch of brown bear history just being cut off. It stands a little farther from Egypt than the other bears, but it belongs to the same lost northern African animal world that ancient Egyptians looked into, traded across, and imagined beyond their own frontiers. And that world, piece by piece, disappeared. Number 1. Sivatherium. At number 1 is the Sivatherium, and this is the most controversial animal in the entire countdown. Fossils show that Sivatherium was real, enormous, and present in Africa for a very long time. A scientific review of African material describes the genus as having a Pan-African distribution through the Pliocene and early Pleistocene, and it specifically includes the Wadi Natrun in Egypt, among the African localities used to track its evolution. That means the Sivatherium absolutely belongs to Egypt's deep prehistoric past. The part that's less certain is whether it survived late enough for pharaonic Egyptians to see it with their own eyes. Claims connecting Sivatherium to much later human imagery or artifacts have existed for decades, but scholars have also questioned those links rather than treating them as settled fact. Even without caution, though, it's easy to see why Sivatherium refuses to disappear from discussions like this. It didn't look like a normal giraffe. A modern skeletal reconstruction describes it as a giant giraffid with a relatively short neck, short and thickened lower limbs, and ornate cranial appendages. The same study estimated a representative adult body of a mass of about 1,200 kilograms with a range that could extend higher, and concluded that it may have been the largest ruminant animal that ever existed. Now, that's extraordinary by any standard. Instead of the tall, elongated grace of a living giraffe, Sivatherium seems to have had the build of something heavier, lower, broader, and much more imposing. Its head is a huge part of what makes it so memorable. Sivatherium carried 2 different pairs of ossicones, with the rear pair expanded into large, branching antler-like structures. Now, that alone would have made it one of the strangest hoofed animals any human could encounter. From the front, it must have looked almost like a ceremonial animal, as if it were wearing a crown of bone, and from the side it would have looked like a thick-necked giant browser built for force rather than elegance. The same reconstruction study does argue that its forelimb bones were unusually robust for an animal of its size, possibly because of the weight and balance demands created by the massive skull. So this wasn't just a big giraffe, it was a giraffid built on a completely different plan. The British Museum's overview of North African prehistoric rock art explains that the Sahara underwent a major climatic shift and that its rock art preserves animals from a much greener, wetter world. That broader environmental context is important because it explains why late survival ideas for large African mammals have to be so persistent. When people look at ancient Saharan imagery and imagine vanished megafauna lingering longer than the fossil record clearly proves, they are reacting to a real underlying fact. North Africa once supported a far richer animal community than it does now. Sivatherium fits naturally into that lost world, even if its exact final chapter is still unknown. The strongest fossil evidence, though, places Sivatherium in Africa long before dynastic Egypt, not securely within it itself. And while older writers propose that very large images or objects from ancient Near East might preserve memories of the animal, later discussion has treated those claims cautiously and in some cases skeptically. So the safest way to understand Sivatherium here is not as a proven everyday animal of the pharaohs, but as the most haunting borderline case in the countdown. A giant giraffid that definitely belonged to Egypt's prehistoric world, and it may have lingered on in cultural memory far longer than its bones would allow. If Sivatherium did survive late enough to be seen by people in Egypt or its wider frontier, it would have been one of the most spectacular animals any of them ever encountered. A creature with the body mass of a small rhinoceros, the ancestry of a giraffe, and a skull crowned with huge branching ossicones would not have been forgotten easily. Even if the evidence stops short of giving a clean yes, the possibility hangs there because the animal itself is so visually overwhelming. It feels like the kind of beast that should belong in myth, except that paleontology shows it was real. The fossils place it in Egypt's ancient natural history. The environment of the old green Sahara makes its world imaginable, the scientific debate keeps its human timeline unresolved, and all of that leaves behind one unforgettable image. Somewhere behind the familiar Egypt of temples, tombs, and dynasties is a deeper Egypt, older, wilder, even where a giant horned giraffid once walked.